West Ham are the Conference League champions, but winning it came at a cost as the Hammers tumbled down to 14th in the Premier League. So the board have gotten rid of Moyes and asked me to take over, giving me 3 challenges. First, we need to win the Europa League. Secondly, get back into the Premier League top 7, and finally, win the club their first FA Cup since 1980. Luckily for us, the rebuild will be made slightly easier with the sale of Declan Rice for £105 million to Arsenal. But we don't get it all up front, with payments being made over 24 months, meaning that for season 1, we have a grand total of £65 million to spend. So what do we need to fix immediately? West Ham's starting 11 is decent, but I feel like it's lacking in squad depth. We could certainly add another centre-back and a winger to fill in behind Bowen. Plus, we need to fill a Declan Rice-sized hole in the midfield. It turns out this transfer window is going to be full of dilemmas, starting off with centre-back. We could sign Clement Longley from Barcelona for £8.5 million, an experienced head for the back line. Or we could spend £21.5 million on a young Gonzalo Ignacio from Sporting. Longley is the better player right now, but Ignacio isn't far off and should develop more. But his fee will wipe out a third of our transfer budget. If we are serious about the Europa League, then Longley is the obvious choice, but I tend to think a little bit more long term, so for me, Gonzalo is the man we're signing. It's an expensive contract, but I think it's worth it. It does mean we have to cut back spending in other areas, but I think I've just found an absolute bargain. Orlando City's Facundo Torres is young, can play anywhere across the attacking midfield, and importantly, is available for just £8.5 million. I'll be honest, I did want to bring in David Neres, but at double the price, he's not double the player, and we still need that Declan Rice replacement, which was proving difficult. Despite winning the Conference League, the poor league performance meant that top quality replacements were hard to come by. Talents like Verratti and De Jong weren't interested in signing for us, and some great players who were, like Allen, were too old and would only be good for a season or two. In the end, I felt like Cheick Doucouré was a great option, and at just 23 years old, still has room to develop, but it just didn't feel right. Trevor Chalobah isn't getting to Chelsea's all-star team anytime soon, but at 23 he's also still got a lot of room to develop, and he's a lot more defensively minded than Doucouré. Plus, he can also play naturally at centre-back if needed. He's also English, which really helps out with our homegrown status for the Europa League. But best of all, despite being valued at £53 million, Chelsea let us have him for just £35. So all 3 positions I wanted to improve, we have improved. But the squad was getting a little bit bulky, so for £10 million, we sold Antonio, Maxwell Cornet, and Masuaka, giving us a little bit more to play with. So I spent £7.5 million on another Sporting player, 19-year-old Matheus Fernandes, who immediately went out on loan to Portugal's 2nd division. But the new additions allow me to play our 4-3-3, where we build up play from the back and down the wings before using our front 3 to try and score as many goals as possible, where their main duties are to sit narrow and take plenty of shots. So with the season about to get started, I had one final dilemma. Do I start Pablo Fornals or Nikola Vlasic? Both are great players, as good as each other, and right now there is nothing to choose between them, so I'll give them equal opportunities to impress me at the start of the season. It was Vlasic who got the initial nod, and whilst he didn't score in our 3-1 win on the opening day of the season, he did bag in our 3-1 win over Sunderland. Yes, I know Sunderland aren't in the Premier League, but the way these modified databases work that are up to date is that modders can update the league fixtures, but they can't update the cup or playoff fixtures. So I had to keep restarting the game until West Ham won the Europa Conference League to qualify for the Europa League for this video. That took long enough that I didn't want to keep doing it until Luton also got promoted. Either way, Vlasic also scored in our 3rd game of the season, another 3-1 win, and whilst we couldn't score against Man City, we won against Sheffield United with Vlasic scoring to go 2nd in the table. By this point, I was pretty much set on Vlasic starting, but for fairness, I had to try out Fornals, which was a mistake as he dropped a 6.2 from 3 games. Vlasic is our man. The other wing was actually more of a debate, as by 10 games into the season, both Bowen and new signing Torres were contributing. Torres scored a brace past Hibs on our opening day of the Europa League group stage, but Jarrod Bowen had notched up 6 assists so far this season. I guess I'll keep swapping these 2 around until I make a decision in January. Speaking of the Europa League, we've been drawn against Hibs, Rennes, and Ferencváros. A kind draw, all things considered. If we could beat Rennes, then we should easily top the group. And luckily, we thrashed them 3-0, although we had to rely on a single Gianluca Scamacca goal to beat Ferencváros. And actually, with all our talk on which inside forwards to start, we'd actually been looking past Scamacca, who had gone on to score 11 goals in 13 starts, although he didn't score in the return game to Ferencváros as we drew 0-0 before then losing 2-0 to Rennes. Luckily for us though, Rennes had slipped up in earlier games, so a 3-0 win over Hibs was enough for us to seal first place in the group and go straight through to the round of 16. Back to league action, and December had been immense for us, so much though we went undefeated. But despite that, on January 1st, we still only sat 8th in the table, showing just how far we still had to go. At this point as well, Bowen had impressed me way more than Facundo Torres, so Bowen was going to be the man for the rest of the season on the right wing. But if we wanted to climb into the European places, it was Gianluca Scamacca that we had to keep. By this point, he'd scored 20 goals in the season, and other clubs were taking note, including Borussia Dortmund, who offered a grand total of 54 million. If we could find a cheap replacement, I'd be tempted to take the money. However, Dominic Calvert-Lewin would be just as expensive to bring into the club, as would Patrick Schick, and whilst he's young with high potential, Evan Ferguson would be upwards of 60 million. Plus, Calvert-Lewin and Ferguson would be cup tied for the League Cup final if we made it there. We'd had a nice run through to the semi-finals, where we had to beat Manchester United for a shot at the trophy. Despite the bid on the table, Scamacca didn't let it get to him, and he scored a hat-trick in a 4-1 win in the first leg. I don't even care that we lost the second leg 2-0, we'd won 4-3 on aggregate, and Scamacca had got us to the final. We can't lose him because we just won't be able to replace him, so I rejected the bid. And he's gonna have to keep up his form, as we get drawn against Arsenal in the final, who of course are the club that gave us 105 million for Declan Rice, which is what we used to build the team to get to the cup final. In the meantime, our January had been good, whereas it was rubbish for our rivals, pushing us up the table. And February only got better, as we had another undefeated month, meaning that securing a top 4 finish was genuinely on the cards. But winning the League Cup would give us European football regardless. The issue is, both our starting centre-backs are suspended and Vlasic is injured. Our season had been built on Zuma and Inacio being an immense duo. Missing one of them would hurt us, but both could destroy us. Sure enough, Arsenal opened up the scoring 3 minutes in, and then 9 minutes in, and by the time their third goal went in, it was all over. We did manage to pull back a late consolation goal, but with both our starting centre-backs missing, we were never going to win. But the board never set us a target to win the League Cup. They gave us a target of winning the Europa League, so that is what we had to focus on. The only issue was we'd been drawn against a strong Ajax side in the round of 16, and they humbled us in the first leg as they won 3-1. We had to turn it round in the second leg. We had plenty of chances to score goals in the first half, but eventually Nikola Vlasic broke the deadlock in the 44th minute. It was now 3-2 on aggregate, and all we had to do was score one more to take it to extra time. However, as much as we tried, we just couldn't find that extra goal, and despite having 25 shots to Ajax's 0, Ajax are the team that progressed. It feels like such a huge missed opportunity. Following that, we also lost the FA Cup quarter-finals, meaning we only had the league left to focus on. Scamacca was straight on it with a hat-trick against Wolves before we beat Spurs by the same scoreline. 3 first-half goals against Liverpool was enough for the win, and after we beat Crystal Palace, we had enough points to qualify for the Champions League, which was very lucky because we played terribly after that, but a 4th place finish was a superb first season and a little bit unexpected, but we did have some unexpected heroes. Scamacca ended up with 43 goals in all competitions, more than double what I'd hoped for. Vlasic had 28 goal contributions, whilst Bowen had 28 assists in total. And even Souček had an unreal return from centre mid. So heading into the new season, it was going to be really difficult to keep those 4 players, but hopefully the appeal of Champions League football would keep them at the club. Now, there is enough money in the budget to give a new contract to one of those 4 players. For me, Souček is the most dispensable, and we might even replace him this summer. Vlasic didn't contribute to as many goals as Bowen, who also counts as homegrown, but I think he could be replaced by Facundo Torres if needed. The hardest to replace is going to be Scamacca, so he's the one that got the new contract. And whilst we talk about those 4 great players, there actually are some areas of a team that we do need to improve. Areola is still a good age for a keeper, but I think we can do better. And I also think we can do better in both wing-back positions as we look for younger, better models. I'm also thinking we have a lack of depth in the midfield. If our starting three gets injured, we are struggling. Luckily, finishing in the top four, the board gave us 20 million, which was topped up to 55 million with the next Declan Rice instalment, which then turned into 75 million as we said goodbye to Danny Ings for 20 million to Brighton. So we also need a new backup striker. But before the window even opened, we signed young right-back Tino Livramento from Southampton for 31 million. It meant that we got the 21-year-old Englishman for way under market value, as 31 million was his release fee clause for teams in a higher division. But 31 million is a lot of our budget taken away. So luckily, we got our new keeper on a free transfer. Guillermo Vicario joined us after finishing his contract at Empoli and offers a slight but important upgrade on Areola. But that's where our good luck for now ended. We tried to sign Lucas Nmecha as a backup striker, but he went to Tottenham instead. And a work permit for Gianluca Busio to be back up to Trevor Chalobah was rejected. Both deals would have totaled 25 million, which would have been insane value for money, but it wasn't to be. Thankfully, we did have deals for players in other positions. Luka Sukic joined up for his release fee clause of 16.75 million from RB Salzburg before we had to adjust our budget slightly to bring in Matheus Nunes from Wolves for 35 million. This left us with no transfer budget, so we had to start selling. With Livramento joining the team and Ben Johnson as backup, Kufal was surplus to requirements, so he also went to Brighton for 7.25 million. We hardly used Saïd Benrahma last season, and with Vlasic and Fornals ahead of him, somehow we convinced Fulham to pay 30 million for him. Manuel Lanzini was also a player we hardly used, and drumming up interest was tough, but eventually we got him sold to Tigres in Mexico for 17.5 million. After adjusting our budget slightly to accommodate our overspill on the wages, we had about 15 million to spend. I had been looking at backups for Chalobah, but with this sort of money, we could actually sign a replacement. And perfectly timed, I was alerted to the £23.5 million release fee clause of Manu Kone, who offers a lot more than the older Trevor Chalobah. So we quickly got him signed up before anyone else could put a bid in. But then we found the absolute deal of the rebuild. Gabriel Barbosa has 6 months left on his contract, or we could pay £6 million for the striker now, which is exactly what we did. Now, I was going to use the rest of our budget on a brand new left back, but an opportunity arose. Ethan Ampadu, Taylor Harwood-Bellis, and Brandon Williams were all being released by their clubs at the end of their contracts. Whilst not good enough for our first team yet, they're all young British players who have homegrown status. This would be perfect for our team, so I moved all of our remaining transfer budget into the wage budget and offered them contracts, which they accepted. This also allowed us to move Agard for 12.5 million to Valencia and send Thilo Kehrer to Montpellier for 10 million. And with those outs, our summer business was finally done. We had significantly strengthened the team overall, but with there being so many new faces in the team, we could run into the possibility of struggling with team cohesion, especially when the Champions League games kicked in. Luckily for us though, the front three carried on right where they left off. Vlasic scored an opening day brace as we beat Manchester United before Bowen scored a brace in a 5-0 win over Luton Town, before he got another against Forest where a Scamacca goal sealed another 5-0 win. Things were looking great if you ignored the 1-0 losses to Spurs and Villa. The Champions League was about to start, and we were given a real mix of teams for the league phase. Lazio at home was a tough start, but Vlasic's goal just before half-time was enough to seal the win. Our next game was much easier as we put 4 past Swiss side Young Boys. AC Milan were a sticking point as we rescued a late draw away from home, but when we brought Real Madrid to our place, Nunes and Scamacca showed them just who was the boss, and we ran away 2-0 winners. It's just a shame we then lost 1-0 to Ajax. All the while, our Premier League form was incredible, with Scamacca averaging out at a goal a game. Vlasic was providing a bunch of assists, but our marquee signing of summer Matheus Nunes was providing real value for money with his 7 assists. So by early December, we were right in the title fight with Man City and Chelsea. Could we actually stay there? Well, our next game was against league leaders Man City, who took the lead in the first half, but an inspired second half followed as Zuma got our first. Scamacca then scored a penalty before Fornals scored one late on off the bench to send us top of the table. To stay there though, we are going to need stability, so I offer brand new contracts to Zuma, Bowen and Souček. who all had deals expiring at the end of the season. But maybe offering player stability and a guaranteed future and not having to play for their lives meant we dropped out of form a little bit, as after they signed contracts, we drew to the worst side in the Champions League, lost in the League Cup, and lost our first game in the Premier League since Aston Villa in early December. Fortunately, Chelsea and Man City also struggled, so we remained on top of the table heading into the new year. If we wanted to win this title, there was one key area that we had to improve. Emerson and Brandon Williams are both competing for our left-back spot. And whilst they're good players, neither really have the ability to be part of a title-winning team. My plan was to replace them with Alejandro Balde, who isn't getting game time at Barcelona, but has the potential to be insane. Issue is, he's going to cost us £52 million, money that we don't have. So I spoke to the board. Please can you sign Balde to help us win the title? And it turned out the board would give us the money if we won our remaining 4 games in January. And given our form had recently taken a dip, well, this was going to be pretty difficult. But we made easy work of Fulham, and Manu Kone even scored a rare goal. We went behind against Manchester United, but after Scamacca opened our account, Bowen scored the winner on the hour mark. Leicester were up next, and with Barbosa coming off the bench to score and win us the game, it meant all we had to do to secure the funds for Balde was beat 20th place Luton Town. And boy, did we batter them, with Bowen and Scamacca both scoring hat-tricks as we won 9-1. So true to their word, the board gave us $52 million and we put a bid in and a contract for Balde. I want the deal done quickly though so he can play in our next match, which is conveniently against Barcelona in the Champions League. It was our final game in the league phase, and if we won it, we'd secure a top 8 finish. Draw or lose, and it's likely we'll have to go to the extra knockout round. Frustratingly, he didn't sign before the game, and actually played against us as Barcelona went on to beat us, dropping us down to 9th place in the league phase, meaning we have to go to that extra knockout round. I guess Barca were too clever to let him come to us before we played them, but on deadline day, he finally signed and we had our brand new left back. Our 4 wins in January had also propelled us away from Man City, Liverpool and Chelsea, sitting 7 points clear. With 12 games to go, we could genuinely win the title. For the most part, we just kept winning, recording big wins over most of our title rivals, as well as progressing in the FA Cup. But we were unfortunately knocked out of a Champions League by Liverpool. But this just gave us more time to focus on the league and FA Cup. In the quarterfinals, we took an early 2-goal lead against Tottenham, who then scored late on, but it was too little too late. We progressed to the semi-finals where we played Norwich, and it was a tight affair, but we eventually broke the deadlock in the 80th minute before adding in another in the 90th to reach the final. In the league, results were still positive despite a 1-1 draw to Arsenal, and with 5 games to go, we had a 3-point lead and a game in hand over Man City. But despite the hiccup in the 1-1 draw to Arsenal, Scamacca scored all 5 goals as we beat Newcastle 2-0 and then Forest 3-0. Thanks to Spurs getting 2 men sent off, we battered them 5-0, meaning that if we beat Leeds United away, we will be the Premier League champions. We had some good chances early on, but we just couldn't get the ball in the back of the net, as the keeper made saves and we blazed a few over the bar. However, Man City fell behind Brighton, our former player Danny Ings scoring the goal, meaning even if we drew, we'd still win the title. But even better for us, we then took the lead at the start of the second half, as a high press meant we won the ball and Scamacca could finish. But then disaster struck, as Balde picked up a second yellow card, meaning we had to play the last 20 minutes with 10 men. And Leeds were pushing. Despite already being relegated, they wanted to go down fighting. But the goal never came. West Ham are the Premier League champions. That is absolutely insane. It's been an absolutely unreal season that neither me or the board were expecting, especially given that our 5-year target was just to get West Ham back in the top 7. But we had a chance to tick off a different board objective if we could beat Manchester United in the FA Cup final. We took an early lead thanks to an ingenious move between Paqueta and Scamacca, who was just onside. We then doubled our lead thanks to Vlasic being in the right place at the right time, before Scamacca's powerful shot from point-blank range gave us a 3-0 lead at half-time. Vlasic then added a 4th at the start of the second half, which gave us an unassailable lead. United did score a consolation goal in the 90th minute, but it wasn't enough to stop us from winning our first FA Cup since 1980 and completing another board objective. But seeing as we had overperformed so much, the board changed our remaining objective. No longer did we want to win the Europa League, but instead we had to win the Champions League. So how do we improve this team to win the Champions League? Well, once again, the front three are fine, as they scored 85 goals between them. Paqueta and Nunes had an average rating of just above a 7. Manu Kone had one of the lowest average ratings in the team, so there is scope to improve there. But we do have youngsters Luka Sukic and Matias Fernandez coming back from loan to fill in there. Our wingbacks are both young and new, so I'll keep them. Whilst Vicario kept 34 clean sheets in all competitions last season, and Kurt Zouma had the best average rating in the team outside of our front three. So I think we might need to improve Gonzalo Inacio, who had a low average rating and hasn't actually improved that much since joining the team. The board gave us £70 million, which was then topped up by £20 million for the remaining Declan Rice transfer fee. This meant we could buy a world-class centre-back. So I triggered the £70 million release fee clause of Giorgio Scalvini. Despite his winning the title, he had more interest in joining Manchester United, who also put a bid in, so we offered him a big contract and hoped for the best. But our best wasn't enough, as he chose Man United on less money than we offered him. So instead, we went for our backup option, offering £55 million for Mark Gay, who accepted the offer within days to become a West Ham player. This left us with £35 million to play with, plus an extra 12 after we agreed to sell Areola to Watford, but we replaced him with Rui Silva from Sporting for £11 million. We then raised a further £27.5 million by selling Emerson, Luizao and Flynn Dowles, giving us £60 million to spend. And it could have been more, as we were then hit with a £70 million bid from PSG for Jarrod Bowen. For me, that just isn't enough money, so I rejected the bid, which was enough to put PSG off and never actually make another bid. But I don't think we need to spend the £60 million. We have a Premier League winning team that we've just improved with a better centre-back. Plus, we also have the addition of Matias Fernandez after his second loan spell away from the club, and I have promoted the wonder kid that we got through our youth intake to back up to Vlasic, who genuinely looks like one of the best 17-year-olds I've ever seen. So we will keep hold of that £60 million until January if we need to sign someone then. But maybe we should have spent the money, as we got battered by Man City in the Charity Shield before having a very indifferent start to the season. Our focus this time around was on the Champions League. So whilst I could live with draws and losses in the league, a 0-0 with Copenhagen wasn't on. Luckily, we did get our first win in the Champions League by relying on our regen wonder kid John Renwick, who scored an 87-minute winner away from home against PSG. He also scored late on as we battered Napoli 8-1 at home, Scamacca scoring 4 of the goals. Ghent also fell, as we put 5 past the Belgian club, before this season we beat Ajax by a 0-0 to get revenge for the previous 2 seasons. Despite not featuring much, Souček still scored a hat-trick as we eased past Juventus to put us on top of the league phase by New Year with 2 games to go. As our priority was the Champions League, we had eased off a bit in the Premier League. We didn't lose many games, but we were drawing. And that was mainly down to Vlasic not scoring like he had done in the previous 2 seasons. Our regen, John Renwick, will be good, but he's not a first teamer yet. And with us being so far off the title fight this season, we were going to need more goals if we were going to secure a top 4 finish and get Champions League football again. So with the money we spent in summer, we triggered the £40.5 million release fee clause of Andreas Schelderup from Benfica. For a 21-year-old, he wanted a ridiculously large wage, but if he was going to secure his top 4 football and help us win the Champions League, I think making one of the club's top earners is worth it. And he did score a brace on his debut, even if it was a 7-0 win over League One Forest Green in the FA Cup. But he did also help us to an unbeaten January, where a draw and a win in the Champions League saw us qualify for the round of 16 in 3rd place. Plus, our January league form was followed up by a winning February, which gave us an 11-point gap to 5th heading into the final 10 games. But our attention was fully on that Champions League, where we had been given a kind draw against St. Gallen from Switzerland. Bowen scored a brace in the first half before Scamacca, Barbosa and Gay scored in the second half to give us a 5-0 lead in the first leg. Souček and Livramento then added in the second leg to secure a quarter-final spot where we'd faced Barcelona. We needed Alejandro Balde to be on top form against his former club, but it was Barcelona's right winger Ousmane Dembele who got the better of our left back, opening the scoring in 10 minutes. Despite being the side on top, we left it until the 90th minute for Sheldrup to put a corner onto Gay's head to level things up. Fortunately, the home leg was next, and our crowd roared us on to victory with goals from Scamacca, Trevor Chalobah and Jared Bowen to secure a spot in the semi-finals against Manchester United, who had recently beaten us 5-2 in the Premier League. Scamacca hit first before Sheldrup scored a second at the start of the second half. United did get back into the game thanks to a goal from Heung-min Son, but we kept United at bay for a 2-1 lead. The second leg was going to be tough though, and Bruno Fernandes opened up the scoring with a penalty to make it 2-2 on aggregate heading into half-time. But for every big occasion, you need a big man, and our big man is Gianluca Scamacca. The Italian levelled things up, which gave us the lead on aggregate before Sheldrup scored a second for West Ham to reach the Champions League final. At least United had the last laugh in the league, as they won the title ahead of Chelsea and us. Before we play in the Champions League final though, we also have the FA Cup final to play. Admittedly, we had a very kind run throughout the tournament, and Wolves, who had struggled in the Premier League this season, should be a routine win. But there weren't many chances for us in the first half, and the score was level at half-time. Despite all our best efforts, we just couldn't score, and then disaster struck. Wolves got a goal in the 80th minute, and despite our domination on the day, Wolves went on to lift the trophy. I am praying that is not a bad omen for the Champions League final. To counteract it, make sure you drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. Our team was fully fit, but PSG had a star-studded lineup that could cause us a world of pain if we got it wrong, and we almost did early on. Vicario rushing out only to get tackled by Mbappe. Luckily, he couldn't get a shot on goal and we won possession back, racing to the other end of the pitch and almost scoring. But then the breakthrough came. PSG were caught dawdling on the ball, which allowed Bowen to win his tackle and place his shot past the keeper. Shortly afterwards, another chance came through, but Paqueta's shot in the end went just wide of the mark. But luckily for us, we have the Premier League's top assister in Jared Bowen, and he put a corner onto Scamacca's head, who doubled our lead. There was almost a third goal as Paqueta's next shot went just high and wide. We were all over PSG, who managed just 2 shots in the first half. Could this really be happening? In the second half, PSG shut us down an awful lot better, and then they finally scored a goal. They got back into the game as Neymar found an open Phil Foden, who had time and space to shoot. To try and see the game out, we brought on Ben Johnson and Matías Fernandes, who offered us stamina and stability to see the game out. But as the clock ticked down, time for PSG ran out. We had done it. We'd held off the PSG attacks and we'd won West Ham the Champions League. I can't quite believe how quickly we've actually done it. I planned for 5 seasons to win the Europa League, and we won the Champions League in 3 seasons. If you want to see me try and win the Premier League with Leicester City again, you can watch that video on screen right now.